Great. As I mentioned, welcome to the Zoning Administrators Roundtable. We will be recording this and having this presentation available to folks who were unable to come. We'll also be sending the presentation to you, so don't feel like you have to kind of remember everything that you're seeing on the screen. And we will be following up, also sending a link to a survey that we hope that you will fill out to help us in our outreach efforts. Great, it's good to see folks putting their names in the chat. Welcome everybody to this Zoning Administrators Roundtable. As I mentioned, what I'm going to do is kick it over to my colleague John Ignatowski, which is going to start off with our first presentation. Take it away, John.
Thank you, Claire. Hi there, I am John Ignatowski, also a planner for the CVRPC. Just a little bit of background about how I got here. I was educated in planning, graduated in 2020 with a master's in regional planning, worked for Northfield, Vermont as their economic development director for 2 years, and was Bolton, Vermont's ZA for 2.5 years. Just actually finished up that position on Friday. So have some zoning experience underneath my belt and happy to share what I've learned from that, my time there. But yeah, let's launch into the first presentation. So I'm going to share my screen, hopefully successfully. There we go. I'm hoping everyone can see this. But today we have a couple of things on our agenda. And let's see here. We're both looking at the RAPs, required agricultural practices, and then also state legislation on ADUs. We already did the welcome and introductions. So let's launch into the RAPs. So I guess to provide a little more context, when I was ZZA, I often struggled the most with state regulation. As a new ZA, I assumed that our zoning regulations were the Bible and that it incorporated everything that I needed to know. But that wasn't the case. I learned that there is state law that you have to be cognizant of, that oftentimes your local zoning isn't completely in parallel with or implicitly mentions, but doesn't completely go into the full depth of what a ZA is supposed to know about the state law. It took me a little while to finally learn the breadth and scope of state law. And sometimes our zoning laws were outdated and state law had changed, and I would rule a decision on an application, and I get a nice letter from a lawyer saying, hey, we think you interpreted this wrong. And then diving into state law, I realized that, yep, our zoning regulations are outdated and incorrect. So just wanted to preface this presentation with that little anecdote of why being up to date with state regulation is important. So the way I'll approach these presentations is, since there's 2 of them, we will hold off on questions until the end of each segment. That does not prohibit you from entering questions into the chat, though, as this presentation goes along. So hoping to move through each of these within 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A session at the end of each presentation. I need to figure out how to hide all you so I can see my presentation. No offense. Go away. Okay. So what are the RAPs? Essentially, state regulation establishing practices and management strategies for farms, governing essentially their effluent. So these are focused on water quality and making sure that our local waterways in Lake Champlain isn't impacted by erosion, sediment, nutrient loss, and manure. So these are the RAP elements. So it's a pretty broad piece of legislation, a broad rule. We're not going to go into too much detail about all these different elements. And just to preface this presentation even more, this is more for you to understand what the take-home messages are from this regulation rather than me diving into all the nuances of the law. We can certainly ask questions more about the nuances. I'm not an expert though. We're just trying to give you an overview of the law so you know how it applies to your role as a ZA. So the biggest take-home message that I can provide for this is a municipality cannot apply its zoning regulations to farming operations, structures, activities, etc., that are subject to the RAPs. And that certainly has caveats, which I will get into later. So a big one that often ZAs deal with are farm structures. Farm structures subject to the RAPs are exempt from zoning permits, but there are rules that the farmer must abide by. For instance, they need to notify you and the town clerk about what their project is, which contains a sketch plan of the project. Local setbacks must be observed, but if you go down to number 6, the farmer can request additional setback waivers if they feel that they are necessary. And there's A&R rules that this farm structure also has to abide by as well. Accessory on-farm businesses, that's also a fairly new piece of legislation that changed, AOFBs. So these are not part of the RAPs, but they are related. So an AOFB is this on-farm associated business, and there's thresholds here. So it's like up to no less than 50% of the business has to be associated with that farm, whether it's be measured by qualified products or total sales. And an AOFB can look like an educational, recreational, or social event that features agricultural practices or qualifying products. And so what you need to know about this is that a municipality cannot prohibit a farm from having an AOFB, but Act 143 enables a town to review these under site plan review for compliance with any performance standards that your town has adopted for similar commercial uses, whether that's operating hours, setbacks, curb cuts, or etc. But this does not eliminate other permitting requirements, such as those necessary to operate a business. So what is not an AOFB, since there is that 50% rule of what that AOFB has to be associated with as far as qualifying products? If that business is unassociated with the farm, if it's located off-site, or where more than 50% of the annual sales are generated from non-qualifying products, usually products that are not produced on that farm, that isn't an AOFB, or a business that's just a farm. So if it's wholly dedicated to farming activities, not an AOFB, but just a farm. So here's the gray area, or the area in which a farm does not fall underneath the RAPs, and this is where municipal zoning becomes an important consideration. So when does a farm not fall underneath the RAPs? And I have some photos here, not necessarily indicative, but of things that could be operations that fall outside of the RAPs and within municipal zoning. So I'm just going to fly through these next 3 slides. The purpose here is to show you that there are very stringent definitions for what a farm is and what activities constitute farming. So for instance, this is the definition of farming directly taken from statute. So I just highlighted a few words here so you can scroll through. We will be sending you this presentation as well. So I'm not expecting you to memorize these, but just wanted to show you that there is a very defined understanding of what a farm is in Vermont. There also is a definition of agricultural practice. And these terms are important because these terms are used throughout the RAP rule and define what practices, structures, and farming activities are underneath the RAP. So helpful for you to know if you're trying to figure out, is this a farm or not? Or is this activity a farming activity or not? And then finally, the definition of a farm structure. The structure has to be used primarily for farming, but this also excludes a dwelling for human habitation. So I did receive a question in an email asking if there's a homestead associated with the farm, which we see all across Vermont, is that homestead excluded? No, that farmstead would actually be subject to municipal zoning. So it's the RAPs don't exclude the entire property and farming institution from municipal zoning. It's more like piece by piece. Does this structure fall under the RAPs? Is this practice underneath the RAPs? So if there is an element of the farm that is not part of the farm, then it does fall underneath the municipal zoning regulations. So this is a very important slide to help you understand how RAPs do or do not apply to a farming operation. These are the thresholds that will distinguish a small farm that does not fall in RAPs versus a farm that does. And just for some more context, once a farm is in the RAPs, there are 4 other categories that apply to the farm based on size. We won't really go into that today since that's a little bit outside the scope of this presentation, but just wanted to let you know that the state does regulate very large farms differently from medium-sized farms, from very small farms. So as far as that threshold in which a farm is underneath the jurisdiction of RAPs, or outside of at least, so if you're operating on less than 4 acres and you have too few animals to qualify, you're outside of the RAPs. If you're operating on less than 4 contiguous acres to cultivate and harvest, you're outside of the RAPs. And please note the or here, it's not and, it's or. Or does not have an annual gross income from the sale of agricultural products of at least 2,000 gross, or is not managed by a farmer filing a 1040-F, or does not have a prospective business or farm management plan. I think probably the biggest one here that applies the most would be the 4 contiguous acres used to raise livestock and has too few animals. I think having been raised and grown up on a farm myself, my mom boarded horses. It's pretty easy, I think, to have more than 4 acres and more than 4 horses to fall within the RAP. So as a ZA, it's these thresholds that I think you'll carry with you the most when you're assessing, is this a farming operation that applies to our zoning or not? So the next slide will address this too few animals portion of this, because I imagine folks immediately saw that and asked, well, how many animals do qualify or not qualify? And here's the list straight from the state. I'm not going to go through it all, of course, but I think we see a lot of horses in Vermont, since those could be both a boarding operation or just pets, or someone has kids that likes to ride. And 4 equines, which I thought was interesting, since if you have 4 or more equines, then you're in the RAPs if you have these horses on more than 4 contiguous acres. And then there's more animals here as well. Not sure how one's going to measure 1,000 pounds of cultured trout. I'd leave that up to you to be creative with that one. But there are hard and fast thresholds of specific animals in which you are subject to the RAPs or not, provided that you are on 4 or more contiguous acres. So if you're having a hard time telling if an operation is a farm under the jurisdiction of the RAPs or not, you can certainly contact the VAAFM. Prior to contacting them, you should apply your zoning regulations to that operation until the farm operator can prove that they are subject to the RAPs. So it's kind of the burden of proof is on them to show that they are not they're not subject to your local municipal zoning. So I just imagine some situations that a ZA might encounter. I encountered one of these before, but these seem to be situations that you might encounter as a ZA when you're looking at a farm. a landowner claiming RAP exemptions for a structure that they are not subject to. So I think some landowners may have a very general understanding of what the RAPs are and may believe that if all farm structures in Vermont are exempt from local zoning, but as you now know, there are specific thresholds in which they do and do not apply. So if someone's trying to put up a barn in their backyard and they have 2 horses, they may claim that this is exempt. That is not the case. So it's important to understand what those thresholds are when working with landowners in potential projects. There's another situation that might occur, an RAP farm that wants to build a structure or establish an accessory on-farm business that is not related to the farm operation. That would, of course, fall underneath municipal zoning if it's not related to the farm operation. Even if it's on the farm, those structures have to be directly related to that farming operation. And then the last situation, and this is not a comprehensive list, this is just a list I came up with potential situations that I thought might be common across Vermont and in our towns in this region. The third situation I imagine would be a small farm operation that doesn't realize that they are subject to the RAPs, since I imagine that folks are not reading that list of animals every day. And it's having grown up on a horse farm, I understand it's really easy to collect horses. They just kind of show up sometimes. So if people don't know that 4 horses is that threshold, I imagine it's fairly easy for someone not to realize that when they acquire that fourth horse, they are now subject to the RAPs. So just wanted to highlight some issues that are situations that as a ZA you might encounter related to the jurisdiction of the RAPs. So if it's not a farming operation regulated by the RAPs, what next? Well, as a municipality, you're not required to regulate small scale backyard farming operations. De facto, if you have zoning regulations, they probably already are. If you have setbacks for streams, if you have yard and lot setbacks, all those zoning regulations that you have in place will apply to these operations, including construction of buildings. So if someone's putting up a greenhouse in their backyard and they don't fall underneath the RAPs, then that's definitely a structure that would require a permit, unless there's always caveats to zoning, unless you do have an exemption for small structures. So if the structure does fall beneath a certain square footage, it might not need a permit, but these also would fall underneath any type of floodplain regulations you would have as well. Here are some other ways a municipality can apply its zoning regulations to non-RAP farming operations. I will avoid the temptation to bore you to death by reading this verbatim, but these are just some strategies that a town can use to address any potential nuisances that they may encounter with backyard farming operations. Like I said, you can elect to not regulate these at all, but there are strategies that one can employ, a PC can install within their local zoning regulations if need be. So I just found a couple examples of how different municipalities, I should say cities, have regulated farming across the state. I know Burlington's outside of a region, but they have some pretty interesting zoning regulations regarding farming. This is the most comprehensive that I found in Vermont, where they actually specify what type of urban farming is allowed and exempt in the city. And so they provide some pretty specific thresholds here of what type of farming activities can occur within city limits. Montpelier's example here, I think, is more common across our region, where they just spell it out within the use table, where, for instance, like a greenhouse is either permitted or a conditional use depending on the specific district. Agriculture and forestry, of course, is also mentioned. We'll go into that soon, since those are also, forestry is also an exempt activity. stable or equine facility, kind of they are prohibiting that use in most districts. But I should point out that this zoning table only applies to non-RAP operations. So if there is a 4-acre, 4-horse operation, they wouldn't need a permit. So that's just one thing a zoning administrator should be aware of, is that those thresholds in which this table would then not apply. So just moving on to other things that are tangentially related to the RAPs, but not in the RAPs, just focusing on different industries that rely on the land and have exemptions. Cannabis is not part of the RAPs, so therefore subject to municipal zoning. And cannabis establishment can mean anything from cultivating, wholesaling, manufacturing, retailing, testing, etc. But there is one caveat in which if a small cultivator, which that is a very specific definition, that is someone who's cultivating less than 1,000 square feet or less outdoors, if they're establishing that small cultivation business on a farm already subject to the RAPs, then they fall underneath the RAPs. I do not know how common this is, and I know we are still in flux with these regulations, but just wanted to point out that there is one caveat to cannabis not being part of the RAPs. Moving on to silviculture and forestry. So silviculture and forestry are also exempt from zoning. These fall underneath the acceptable management practices, other known as the AMPs. The AMPs apply to all logging operations on private and public lands in Vermont, regardless of the purpose. And so I think it's important to point that out. So for instance, logging may be conducted for forest management purposes or for the purpose of clearing for commercial, residential, or utility development. So the AMPs apply when someone is clearing for residential purposes. It's not just a more conventional logging operation as we understand it. The way the AMPs work, it gives the logger the presumption of compliance. So there is no one there watching over their shoulder when they are logging the woods. It's the expectation that the folks that are logging are following the AMPs. And if you're following the AMPs, you essentially are de facto permitted for this activity. And enforcement is complaint driven. So loggers are responsible for implementing the AMPs, and landowners need to be very careful that whoever is logging their land, the AMPs are being followed since they are responsible. They will be held liable, and the AMPs are important, similar to the RAPs, for protecting Vermont's water quality. So just want to touch upon some other regulations that apply to forestry and that a ZA should be aware of. So logging over 2,500 feet requires an Act 250 permit. If a landowner plans to cut 40 or more acres heavily, you need to have an intent to cut notification from the Vermont Department of Forests, Parks and Recreation. And if a landowner is part of the use value appraisal program, they must have an approved forest management plan. I'm sorry for going ahead there. As far as state statute, there is this particular provision as far as how a town can regulate clearing. And Claire and I have been talking about this one for a long time, since there are lots of gray areas with this. We haven't come to 100% understanding of what this means for writing regulation into your bylaws, but it's definitely, this is the enabling legislation that allows the AMP, or in other words, your DRB or your PC, whoever's doing the quasi-judicial review work, to use certain conditions on projects if they are going through development review. So if there's an application before the DRB and that application otherwise has to be reviewed, and if you have standards in your bylaws that allow a DRB to limit clearing, that's allowed under state statute. Those conditions of approval do have to be clearly predicated on certain protected resources such as wildlife habitat, threatened or endangered species, or other natural, historic, or scenic resources. But from what we've been able to glean from this enabling statute, it seems like cutting trees alone is not a trigger that a municipality can install into their bylaws as putting essentially where a ZA would then pass or forward a application to the DRB. There has to be an underlying reason to review the clearing. So some good examples of this are like forest and conservation districts, where those districts are established on the protection of natural resources. A few towns do have overlay districts for protecting scenic resources, and those overlay districts would allow a DRB to prevent certain amounts of clearing. But tree removal alone, it appears, can't be a threshold for review. Let me move my screen a little bit here. So I think that's all I wanted to say about that. I imagine we might have some more questions about that, since there are certain situations where it's difficult to determine, does this fall underneath AMP, or is this development activity that should be regulated and requires a permit? I think Claire and I this morning looked at the definition of land development, the state definition of land development, at least. A little bit vague. Clearing is not part of that definition, although change of use is. So this is where the gray area is. Where does municipal discretion start? AMPs are applicable during a clearing process until the clearing's done. So that's important to remember. If the AMPs are in place and it's an activity that falls underneath the AMPs, the municipality can't really step in until the AMPs are no longer part of the process. So just ran through a lot of different regulation, a lot of topics. Any questions that you've had about the presentation thus far?
John, we have a couple of questions that are been put into the chat, so I thought maybe we'd start with a couple of those.
Sure.
One of the questions that we've received is, do the farms need to be registered farms, or does this apply to any agricultural activities?
Yeah, there's different processes as far as certification. So the smallest category of the RAPs, they don't need to self-certify, but the larger farms do self-certify. And I know someone asked about a list of RAP farms. I have not found a list of RAP farms. I'm wondering if they don't publish that for privacy reasons. But I imagine they do have a list. It's just I haven't found a publicly published list of all the farms that fall underneath RAP jurisdiction. That would be helpful to know where the bigger farms are, but it's really the small farms that are on the cusp of being, are they RAP or not? So as far as certifying, documentation of such is, I haven't found anything that would be helpful for ZA to know if they have these farms in their town already. It appears that with smaller operations, it's more of a complaint-driven process if there is a problem. It appears that you don't have inspectors going out to these small farms regularly, where with the larger farms, the medium farms, you do have inspectors going out on a routine schedule.
Okay. We have another question about a mixed use building, like a barn with a kid's playroom in it. I guess I'll take a stab at answering that. John, do you want to contribute? Let's see. So if you have a building, only the portion of the building that is being used that meets the definition of a farm structure would be exempted from your municipal regulation. The other portion of the building that is used for non-farming activities would be subject to your zoning regulations, and so making sure that that is within your setbacks. Sometimes this happens when maybe there is a barn that has been used for a farm operation, and then a portion of the barn is to be then kind of converted or renovated into a dwelling unit. That structure then is required to meet your zoning regulations, and for that conversion of that barn space into a non-agricultural use is going to be required to be under the purview of your zoning regulations, and your zoning regulations are going to apply to it. Other question here, I think this was regard to the listing of different activities that are considered farms. There was a question, does the 4 acres include the 2 homestead acres, or is that in addition? And I think, John, this may have been in relation to a slide that you had on the listing of what is defined as a farm. There was a reference
Yeah,
to 4
let me go
acres.
back to that. 4 contiguous acres. I would imagine that would include the same property that the house is located on, because in this situation, you're most likely like 95% of the time when it's a farm this small, that house is going to be on the same lot as the barn. And I don't think they distinguish the difference between the acreage associated with the homestead versus the acreage that's being used to raise livestock. I think it's just, you look at it, it's just the 4 contiguous acres. And if you have 4 acres, whether or not, what else is on that property, I believe that would be the simple way of reading that statute. Great.
One of the other things contained within the chat that they did receive some feedback from some of our other attendees was, what do we do about farmers who do not notify the town of new construction? I think there's a recognition, there is an expectation in your zoning regulation that specifies that they should be. And I'm just wondering if maybe I'll put this question to our participants. Have any of you been in a situation where you have found that there's been a farming operation established and they've not notified you, and what did you do to remedy that situation? Curious if anybody's been in that position. Doesn't seem like they, oh, we got Meredith.
Hi. Yeah, I mean, the situations where we've come across that, once we reach out, usually it's just that they forgot, they thought they did, or they didn't know they had to. And so we reach out and just let them know it's not, they're not gonna have to submit a permit or pay any fees. We just need clarity on what they have built. So we deal with it very similar to any other zoning situation where somebody did something that they didn't know they needed to reach out to us about. And so far, we haven't really had any issues in the last 4+ years I've been here with people getting testy about it.
Great, thanks, Meredith. So I guess what we'll do now is we'll take maybe like 2 more questions.
Claire, I wanted to talk about that. Yeah, in Calais, we had a situation where they put up a couple stands and a couple outbuildings that they did not do a permit for, and they claimed they were agricultural. They were actually CBD pot. Anyway, so we found out about it because John and I are also listers. So we go around to inspect for the listing work of the grand list and found these buildings. And they professed to be part of agriculture, and we, checked Secretary of State. They had registered as a farm. They had registered as a business. And then they promptly put out a do not trespass thing, so we couldn't even go in to inspect, let alone. We did ask them, I don't know how we did, they never ever did give us a permit. So, I mean, we've had that situation, it's just, there it was.
Thanks, Jan. Let's see, Mitch, did you have a question?
Yeah, well, I was just gonna repeat what I typed in the chat, is that I work in Northfield, and we do have a provision in the regulations saying that people are supposed to notify the zoning office of exempt farm structures, and that's tended to not be very well enforced. Excuse me. But what I have adopted as a practice is to notify people that, you know, typically under regulation, that something is required. A permit is required unless it's specifically exempted. And what I've usually said is, hey, submit a zoning permit application. If it's exempt, I will mark it that way, and the permit application will serve as my documentation, and people have responded to that pretty well.
Great, thanks, Mitch. Meredith.
Thanks. I know that we did have one situation where we had a disagreement with the farm about how something was to be managed. And ultimately it takes time, but we ended up reaching out to the state, to the department, to try and get a jurisdictional opinion from them. And because that brings the state in, once you do that, oftentimes, you tell the farmer what's going on. You say, hey, we're going to wait for this opinion from them. And, once you have that added oomph from the state, it gets the ball rolling, and everybody sort of comes on board because they really don't want the state getting all over them. So that is an option. It does take a while. I mean, it took like a year for me to get the jurisdictional opinion from the state because they're really busy and understaffed. But if you are having a really hard time especially where you're dealing with a farm that is already registered with the state, that gives you a little more, little strong arming without actually, trying to go through the judicial enforcement process or anything like that. It is a, sort of last ditch effort.
Great, thank you. So I'm just recognizing our time. What we'll do is I'll have John move on to our next piece of the presentation, and I'm hustling us a little bit just because I want to make sure that we do have plenty of time at the end for any further questions and or any other questions that you may have that don't relate to the topics that we're presenting. So if you do have further questions on the agricultural piece, please put them in the text, in the chat function. And what we'll do is I'll just send it back to John to share the information on accessory dwellings. Please go ahead, use the chat function, and we'll have making sure we have plenty of time kind of at the end for further questions and discussion. So with that, John, take it away.
Thank you so much, Claire, and thank you everybody for those great questions. Keep them rolling. Okay, let's talk about accessory dwelling units. So there were recent changes to this law. But before we dive into the nuances of those changes, we felt that it was important to really set the scene for how the state influences residential development in the state of Vermont. So as you probably all know, in Title 24, Chapter 117, there are 14 planning goals that municipalities, regional planning entities, and state plans are to further. And specifically, planning goal number 11 is to ensure the availability of safe and affordable housing for all Vermonters, including these 4 sub-provisions. So instead of, of course, housing should be encouraged to meet the needs of diverse and social income groups in Vermont. New and rehabilitated housing should be safe, sanitary, and located conveniently to employment, commercial centers. This also discusses multifamily manufactured housing and accessory apartments. So the diagram below really just want to give you like a flow diagram of how the state in Chapter 117 influences residential development. So of course, as a CVRPC and other regional planning commissions, we adopt these goals into our regional plan. And then when your town develops its municipal plan, you typically go through regional plan review to make sure that your plan is in conformance with the regional plan. And if it is, and if it has this planning goal, that will then influence your municipal zoning, since your zoning is premised on your municipal plan. And then your zoning, of course, will then affect and effectuate residential development in your town. And then I just wanted to give a brief overview of how Title 24, Chapter 117 affects zoning. You probably already know this, so my apologies if this is redundant, but the ability to zone in a town is strictly enabled through the state of Vermont. So what that means is you can't do something that the state hasn't specifically enabled. You can't prevent something that the state has required. But you can be more or less strict than the state depending on the intent of that regulation. So it just depends what they're trying to protect or effectuate. So one example I have is, of course, that 50-foot stream setback that the state has. Some towns want to be more strict, and you can implement a 100-foot buffer, but you can't go less than 50 feet. So the particular language that we're looking at today is in 24 VSA 4412, required provisions and prohibited effects. This one's always an interesting read, since these are the very specific provisions that the state requires in zoning. The language being, notwithstanding any existing bylaw, the following land development provisions shall apply in every municipality. And this one is where, in my experience as a ZA, where I've gotten tripped up because our regulations were not always up to date with these specific required provisions. So I would encourage every ZA to always look at this just to make sure that your bylaws are commensurate with 24 VSA 4412. So just to dive into the recent legislation that was enacted October 12th of 2020, the state passed this to promote affordable housing. So the way the state went about this is they amended the definition of accessory dwelling unit, which is the principal topic of this presentation, but just thought it'd be interesting to discuss the other elements of this bill. They are requiring a small lot. Well, I'll rephrase this particular sentence, as this took me a long time to understand this. So if you have a small lot, towns often prohibit development on small lots. But what they're doing here is they're essentially saying, town, you cannot prohibit development on a small lot if it has municipal water and sewer. If it doesn't have access to municipal water and sewer, then the town, as a town, you are able to prohibit development on that small lot. The act also prohibits a municipality from denying a 4 or fewer unit dwelling based solely on the character of the area when the DRB or other AMP entity is conducting conditional use review. This also authorizes municipalities to adopt ordinances to regulate short-term rentals. And lastly, the act invalidates deed restrictions or covenants added to deeds after January 1st, 2021, if they prohibit land development allowed under a town's bylaws. So that's a mouthful. I will follow that up with an example. So if a landowner owns a piece of land and they're looking to sell, but prior to selling it, they decide to add a covenant to their deed, which turns out is pretty easy to do. And they specify that this lot shall never have a multifamily dwelling on it. And if they add that covenant after January 1st, 2021, and if the local regulations, zoning bylaws allowed multifamily dwellings on that property because they're part of a certain zoning district, that deed restriction or covenant would actually be invalidated. They could not actually effectuate that restriction to prevent multifamily dwelling on that property. So we're just going to dive more into ADU language that has changed. The ADU language was already there just in 2020. They amended it to provide for more flexibilities. So what I did here is I essentially struck out the language that was removed and added the language that was added in 2020. So what does this language mean? So beforehand, I think there was a requirement that the owner had to live in the single family dwelling. The single family dwelling had to be owner occupied. What this language has done is that the owner is allowed to live in the dwelling or the ADU. So you cannot require the landowner now to live in the single family dwelling. They have the option to live in either. And what this also does, it allows municipalities to regulate ADUs the same as a single family dwelling. So to provide some more clarification on this, you have the option of not regulating ADUs, which is a separate slide in this presentation, but I thought it'd be important for continuity to mention it now. And you can regulate ADUs all the way up to regulating them the same as a single family dwelling, but you cannot regulate ADUs any more strict than you would a single family dwelling. Moving on to some more language in this particular act, what the state has done here is removed the definition of an ADU as a efficiency or one bedroom apartment and just redefined it as a distinct unit. So that's providing a lot of flexibility since it no longer has a particular form. So an ADU as a result can have multiple rooms as long as it's one unit. And what was also provided for in this language is a new minimum maximum, I should say, which is a little bit confusing, but what it was before is that the unit could not exceed 30% of the total habitable floor area, but they also then introduced a minimum of 900 square feet, whichever is greater. So what they essentially did here is if you have a smaller home that you in 30% wouldn't allow you a lot of space, you could opt for a maximum of 900 square feet. So it's expanding the opportunity for larger ADUs with smaller homes. And as I mentioned before, this is the minimum maximum. A town can certainly not require a size maximum at all. You have that right. And then finally, what this particular piece of language means is that zoning regulations, as I mentioned before, can be more flexible, but not more restrictive with ADUs. And then this very fun language about regulating STRs, short-term rentals, which I imagine can be an entirely different presentation, but we won't dive into the details of that one today. This enables you to differentiate an ADU from a short-term rental. So I just summarized the takeaways from this legislation and just want to touch upon these quickly. Creating more protections and flexibility for ADUs, increases the size of an ADU or increases the maximum entitlement to a size that a property owner can have, allows a property owner to live in the ADU rather than strictly requiring them to live in the principal dwelling, requires bylaws to not regulate ADUs differently than a single family dwelling unless you choose to regulate them in a more flexible manner, simplifying the definition of an ADU as a distinct unit, allowing a municipality to distinguish an ADU from a short-term rental. So what the legislation does not do is require you as a municipality to regulate ADUs, and it does not exempt ADUs from flood hazard areas, fluvial erosion areas, wetlands, streams and rivers in other state regs. So the one piece of homework I have for you is to make sure your bylaws are in conformance with state legislation. When I was early in my career as a ZA, I didn't realize these changes had happened, and they're important because if you have language that was premised on the old ADU state language, you'll be out of date and possibly preventing a landowner from building an ADU that they desire and have a right to build. So it's always important to go back, look at not just the ADU language in state statute, but those other provisions in 4412 that are specified to be in all municipal zoning regulation. There are some pieces of guidance out there that might help you. So this Enabling Better Places document could be a great guide to support local bylaw updates for homes in walkable places. And we also have a list of resources here too. This is, of course, the statute that I've based this presentation off, but there's a few other pieces of information here that might be helpful for you as you consider revising your zoning regulations. So any questions about accessory dwelling units?
Great, thank you, John. Let's see, we do have some questions in the chat that maybe we will start with. We have a question from Kathleen in Marshfield. Does the deed restriction affect land trust protected areas? Not sure, John.
No, it doesn't. So yeah, I read that in the statute. So they exempt conservation easements and other easements. I know with like housing trusts too, they have deed restrictions as well. This only impacts, let me walk that back. They provide very specific exemptions to specific types of deed restrictions that are not prohibited as a result of this legislation. And conservation easements are part of that exemption.
Great, thank you. Question from Mitch in Northfield. My understanding is an ADU is not considered a dwelling when calculating lot density. Is this correct? That is my understanding, Mitch, that is a correct approach to interpreting the ADU language. Not sure if anybody else has any further information they'd want to share on that particular topic. Okay, have another question here, which is a legal question. Does the ZA have the authority to override the local reg if the local bylaw has not been updated to the new minimum requirements, or does it have to be referred to the DRB?
Well, that's a great question. I'm not a lawyer, so I'll premise this conversation with that. But I think, so local regulation is supposed to be in conformance with state. So if you're out of date, I think, I'm trying to think of the best practice here. It wouldn't be wise to follow your old regulation since it is not in conformance with state statute. And that could get you in a whole world of legal trouble if the applicant knows that your language is out of date. I am not aware of specific provisions in state statute. Maybe Claire, you might be aware of something, or someone else here knows the specific ramifications of effectuating local language that is no longer in conformance with state statute. But I believe you'd have better cover if you follow state statute than if you follow outdated municipal regulation. Because I think trying to stick with your municipal regulation can just open up a headache of legal costs. If your regulation actually can't be enforced. And I think that might be the take-home message is if the state has required this, you probably can't enforce your local regulation.
So I saw Meredith perk up here.
I'm going to agree with John on that one. You know, I mean, it's one of those things, if your opinion, your determination as a ZA is that your regulations aren't in compliance with state statute, couple of things. One, you can make a determination that that's the case and you have to follow the state statute. If there's room in your budget to do it, you can also always maybe get just a quickie opinion from your town's attorney to back that up, to attach it. And then, you know, I would be sending that determination to the landowner while also then forwarding that on to whatever body it is that changes your zoning regulations, because they can always do a quick emergency fix to your zoning regulations to do something interim to give you cover while you're then moving forward while they're doing the longer zoning reg change. I mean, that would be the path I would be looking for. We've had to do that kind of thing here in Montpelier since the zoning regs got revamped in 2018, and there were a lot of things that got put in there that either didn't work, or we had some issues where it wasn't even just state statute, it was, you know, constitutional law, Supreme Court decisions where we went, oh, that's unconstitutional. Okay, we're not going to do that anymore, even though the regs haven't changed yet. Because you really want those, you want to try and make sure that whatever you're doing follows the law as much as possible. That's how I would look at it.
Yeah, Meredith, that's great advice, especially having your town attorney look at it. But you know, if someone challenges you and state statutes different than your local regs, you're not going to win in court.
Yeah.
And I think you're going to blow a lot of local tax dollars on a fight that isn't even winnable. And just to reiterate, zoning is a privilege granted by the state. It's enabled by the state, and you can't do things that go against the state. So it's just wise to stick with what the state has essentially mandated. 4412 are mandates. And so, yeah, it's kind of a gray area for ZA, because I know I'm uncomfortable going off the bylaws, since in many ways I look at it as like, this is the Bible of land use in my town. But as I mentioned before in previous anecdotes, I've had lawyers email me with nice letters. Thankfully, they were polite and said, like, you're wrong about this. And I'm like, oh yeah, you're right. And I don't want to go any further with this argument because it might cost us some money. So that's just been my experience in the past. And I think Meredith provided a very good roadmap how a town or how a ZA can proceed and cover themselves in a situation like that.
Great. Any more questions on the ADU, accessory dwelling unit topic?
I was emailed a couple questions. I know someone asked if a unit was being rented out, but was still connected to the house, and that unit, let's say bedroom, didn't have wastewater or kitchen. Could that be an ADU or be regulated as an ADU? The answer is no. The state does provide a very specific definition of what an ADU must include. And that person followed up with, well, how about a unit that has everything but a kitchen? And my interpretation is that still will not be an ADU, because ADUs need to have cooking facilities. So even if it's being used like an ADU, but doesn't have a kitchen, technically by state statute, not an ADU.
Great, thank you. So any last calls on questions specifically related to either this presentation or the previous presentation? Feel free to either raise your hand or unmute. I'm going to kind of scan over our participants. But with that, I think what we want to do is now go into just like an open roundtable. Maybe we can, John, if you wanted to stop sharing your screen. I see that Mitch had a question. So I guess at this point is an opportunity, if you want to ask a question, just go ahead and introduce yourself and let us know, the town that you're from. We did have you put that in the chat to begin with, but thought it would be good just to do a reintroduction, like as you're asking questions in just our roundtable portion. So Mitch, over to you.
Yes, Mitch, I'm in Northfield. And a question I get with increasing regularity has to do with tiny homes. And the kind of comment I'll get from people is that, hey, it's got a composting toilet, so it doesn't need septic. And I'm always a little nervous about that. My understanding is that a dwelling unit needs wastewater and potable water, either, you know, and neither needs to be a separate system or sharing with the main dwelling if it's got the capacity to do so. But I'm always a little nervous about people saying, oh, it's got a composting toilet, so I'm good.
Yeah, Mitch, that's a great question. I think that's, you're right. It's becoming more prevalent across Vermont since housing affordability is a big issue, and tiny homes are one solution to that. But I know Vermont, I know they've been trying to figure this out. I don't think they do have any guidance for us yet, but state wastewater law is the best place to start when thinking about tiny homes. And that's the biggest issue right now, is that, yes, they may have a composting toilet, but is that a permitted composting toilet? Likely no. And they might argue they might be a camp, but there's also certain definitions of how one uses a primitive camp, and you can only use that for like a maximum of 3 weeks, I think. So they would eventually, no matter how they try to cut it, they would fall underneath some type of wastewater regulation and jurisdiction in order to live in that full time. It depends on your town. I know in Bolton, we have a regulation, like you can live in your camper for a maximum of like 180 days before you then have to be zoned as a single family dwelling. And they might claim their camper. It gets a little gray area, of course, since I know in Bolton, we haven't really defined what a tiny home is. So we're always trying to scramble for like related pieces of regulation in our bylaws, but really it comes down to a wastewater issue. And at the end of the day, you need to have a wastewater permit to be in there full time.
We just had one that had pretty much that same situation, and the state said they still had to have a septic system. They could use the composting toilet in an approved location that they put on the septic permit, but they still have to have the septic permit. So didn't really save them much. But I understand they don't actually enforce. They're supposed to put in the septic system, but I don't think the state actually enforces putting in the system.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I know in Bolton, the enforcement component is the certificate of occupancy. So we require a letter from the engineer stating that the system was installed correctly. And since it's a letter from the engineer, they're putting their license on the line. So that's one strategy that we use to make sure that these systems are installed correctly.
Ah.
Great. Let's see. Anybody have another question they would like to ask of the group? I have a question, a follow-up there. Is anybody entertaining any regulations that will address an increase in specifically tiny homes?
We just treat them as a home, as a dwelling. We don't have any minimum size. So, and I don't see any reason why we would need to. I mean, they could still have an accessory dwelling, same as any other place.
Montpelier's handling that the same way, at least for now, where it's treated as a dwelling unit. And that also means that it has to meet, all the sanitation requirements, all of that. And we've had some of the same issues where we have people who can't get on city water and sewer wanting to do the composting toilet situation, where I think everybody's running into that. But I don't think the city's looking at regulating them any differently at this point.
I think that sometimes too, the tiny houses are on wheels. And I don't know if that makes them be, a mobile home type of thing. So I think it's also sometimes there's that. And I do know, again, I'm going to say you can have all the zoning regulations you want, and you may never ever find them. The listers are going to be the people that are going to find these things going out inspecting. And all of a sudden, you've got a small tiny house and a yurt all on the same property. And you know what? I mean, they're subject to taxation, even though they weren't built correctly. So just a thought.
Thanks, Jan. Any other questions or comments from zoning administrators? Feel free to ask a question of, we don't have to have this specifically on the topics that we've discussed. It could be about any topic that you have a question about or a situation that you're dealing with.
I'll throw one out to the group if that's okay. Excuse me. Northfield, for reasons I do not understand, has never required the issuance of certificates of occupancy. And we're in the midst of updating our zoning regulations. And I'm hoping to make the case to the select board that we really ought to modernize and require select COs. And I don't know if anybody's got any thoughts about compelling arguments for them or not.
Yeah, Mitch, I can jump in quickly there because I recently went through that when we were revising Bolton's language about COs. COs are very important for enforcement as far as making sure things were built the right way. So I know with the CO process in Bolton, we measure the structure to make sure it was built correctly. But as I mentioned earlier, that's when we make sure that the septic was installed properly or installed at all. It's also a very valuable tool when folks are building in floodplain areas. So in Bolton, we premise our permits on a CO, and that's a great enforcement mechanism to make sure that they're building exactly what they said they did. So they're not violating any of our floodplain regulations, and therefore like our EREF rate if they do build something more than they claim they did. So it's not just making sure that they built things to spec, but all those other like resource, very like fragile resource considerations to make sure that they didn't impact those areas and resources more than they originally claimed they would. So that's my strongest argument for CO is to effectuate like state regulation with wastewater and other protections. It does add a little bit more work for the ZA, of course, and it just depends how you write that language. In Bolton, we require a CO for every permit. Whether or not that actually happens is a different question. We're trying to revise that language so sheds are not getting COs. But it's an important consideration to have of what should the scope be of the CO process.
So, John, my question to all of that, at Calais, we've debated it. We don't have a certificate of occupancy simply because we don't think we're professional enough to make the judgment as to whether or not the septic system was properly installed or the building was built to spec. And we're all just a bunch of volunteers. So when you put a statute that says you're going to require a certificate of occupancy, who's going to be the inspector to do that?
Yeah, if you remember earlier, I mentioned that we require a letter from the engineer. So I don't inspect the septic. I don't even know what I'm looking at. And that's all underground by the time I'm out there, right? You have an engineer, the engineer who designed their system and worked with them on their permit. That same engineer can provide a letter, and at least in Bolton, they all do. I think that's part of their responsibility, is that they have to put their license and hang their license on that project and be able to certify that that system was installed correctly. So yeah, I don't think there's any expectation that the ZA should be able to inspect the system, and I don't think it's even probable. But as far as like the structure, I don't inspect how the structure was built, since Bolton doesn't have building codes. We're just making sure that the setbacks, like the structure was built where they said it would be built, and so the setbacks were being enforced, and that they didn't clear more than they said they would clear. So it just really depends on what the permit was permitting, what type of construction. But yeah, it's best to premise some of these things on expertise when possible. So the wastewater engineer.
Yeah, and I guess I would just follow up on that. I think kind of a couple of the benefits that I would see is having that kind of consistency across your regulations. So, you know, if in your flood hazard regulations, you have an expectation that there be a certificate of compliance, making that uniformly an expectation kind of across, you know, your whole municipality can help ensure that you have a clear message about kind of what the permit process is. The other piece I think that was mentioned that is a consideration is that, you know, does your municipality have the capacity to administer your certificate of occupancies, because that will be an additional, you know, time expectation on your zoning administrator. So being very clear about what that additional requirement will mean to your municipal capacity. Let's see, I think maybe Kevin, you had a comment there, and then over to Kathleen.
Yeah, we do require the RBES certificate in order to issue the CO. We don't do compliance letters, we do the CO. My biggest problem is actually getting people to let me know they're done their project, because we don't have a time limit on the permits other than getting them going. And I'm just wondering if anyone else has any good ideas on getting people to let me know that they're done.
Great. So I'm just going to hold that for a second. I guess if anybody has any good tips for Kevin on that communication with applicants to let them know to come and get the CO.
We check them out when they get a building permit. They go onto the list for the listers to re-inspect, so that the listers are looking to see whether the building has actually been completed or not and clue us in.
Gotcha. Kathleen, did you have a follow-up question?
Yes, but I forgot it.
Okay. That's okay. Let's see. Any other questions or comments?
Wait, yes, I do remember it
Okay.
now. The state also has a requirement for the building being properly built, which obviously we are not qualified to do. Can we put in our certificate of occupancy that it only is valid for the dimensions of the building and the location of the, and that is proper setbacks, and get a certificate for the septic system or whatever from the engineers? But can we put that right on the certificate of occupancy, so that when realtors and stuff go looking for them, it clearly says we aren't saying anything about the building being built correctly in terms of environmental specs? And also, if the building is smaller than what it's permitted for, is that ever a problem for anyone?
So I guess there's two questions there. One question is clarifying, what you're issuing the certificate of occupancy for. In general, what I've seen in zoning regulations has been fairly broad. I think there's some towns that do specify, that they'll want the wastewater certificate, they'll want the a copy of the residential energy building standard, or the one that applies to commercial buildings. Just curious, are there zoning administrators here? To what extent do your regulations kind of specify the parameters on which the certificate of occupancy will be issued? So seeing.
Sorry did not really be helpful on this part of the conversation. We have, Montpelier is one of the towns that actually has a separate building inspector. And so they handle those building codes. So we have the certificate of occupancy, which is building code related, versus the certificate of compliance, which is zoning specific. So unfortunately, I can't really help out with this one. I didn't know, doesn't the state have to inspect the single family homes in towns that don't have their own building inspectors? So, technically, couldn't your zoning throw something in to have some of those other, some other attestation from the builder at the very least? Even if it's not, even if it's a single family home, so it's not subject to state inspection, just have a letter from somebody.
So in Vermont, those like public safety standards are only going to apply to commercial buildings. So it's a commercial building or to buildings that have 3 or more dwelling units. So what kind of falls under the radar is like those duplexes and single family homes. I'm thinking you could put in you could specify in your zoning regulations and in your certificate of occupancy letter that you issue, you could make a statement that you are certified, you're issuing the certificate of occupancy based upon, the rules and regulations that are specified in your zoning regulations, which will kind of make the connection between I'm going and certifying you to make sure the height of the building is correct, that the setbacks are correct, that you only built the house and you didn't build an extra garage, and ensure that it's clear that what you're certifying to is what is kind of within your parameters of having issued your permit. It's not going to regulate that your plumbing system is correct or that the electrical is correct. That unfortunately in Vermont, we're kind of in that place where it's a little bit of the Wild West. It's a duplex or a single family home. But I think you could put in your language, either in that certificate of occupancy letter, that directly ties what you're certifying to is that it was built to the parameters as specified within your zoning regulations. And if they don't have anything about building code or electrical requirements, then I think that could be an option.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. It's sort of a caveat. It's covering your own butt to say, this is all I'm saying. And if the homeowner happens to also include these other engineering reports, great, you put them in the file, they're there if anybody looks for them, but it's not something where you're verifying something that you can't check.
Yeah. Kathleen, you had a second part to your question, which I should have written down.
If they built something that's actually smaller than what they applied for, is that ever a problem for anyone?
Anybody had any of those situations?
Yeah, I guess in Bolton, it's a problem because it's really hard for the clerks to issue refunds, just for like accounting purposes and auditing. They're very apprehensive of doing that. So I think
just have one fee. We don't have multiple fees based on size. A permit is a permit is a permit.
Yeah, what I've done in the past, if they did overpay, like they built something smaller, since we do have the CO process, like I discount the CO application fee from what they overpaid. But that you'd have to have the CO process in place for that. Since our clerks do not like to give out refunds, that's the best way I found to make it equitable.
Yeah, I think that raised a good point on the fees. I hadn't really thought about that, about reimbursement of fees. In some towns, they do issue the permit fee based upon the square footage. But I mean, that's a good place if you're finding it happen a lot. It would be good to have something written either in your fee schedule or somewhere where that kind of says, if you build something smaller, we'll give you your money back, or too bad for you, we're not giving you your money back and we're just issuing it based on what you said you were going to do. But I think kind of the big take home there is like, you're having to ensure that it is not violating any of your requirements. And if they're further away from the property line and not closer, don't see that as a big issue. It always helps to have that extra documentation in the file to ensure that that's kind of in the record of the property folder. But don't see there being any kind of major issues in those situations. Do want to jump over to a question that is in the chat from one of our participants that doesn't have the ability to join us with her microphone. Karen in Moortown asks, would a development review board be able to set a condition on a primary dwellings within a PUD to limit ADU capabilities or number of ADUs allowed within the PUD? I would say no. I would say that each of the single family dwellings that are in that PUD has the right to have an AUD in it. So if you have a single family dwelling that has more than one ADU, then you're into like multifamily housing now. So I would say that you cannot set that condition. It's specified in statute that they all have to have, every single family house has the right to have an ADU. The DRB can't supersede that statutory requirement. Another question from Callus. This is an interesting one. How many use Australian ballot to vote on amending regulations, or do you use select board approval? So here I might do a quick show of hands. How many of you, when you're going to adopt zoning regulations, how many of your towns require voter approval? Right? Any raise of hands, voter approval? So it looks like Calais, Marshfield, Middlesex, those towns and Moortown require voter approval. So by default, I guess the other towns here just do it by adoption by the select board. Yes, Mitch.
I was just confirming that, yes, select board approves it in Northfield. Where am I? Northfield. Got it.
Great. Thank you, Mitch. Okay.
Is there a limit on ADUs? I mean, it would go into multifamily housing, but kind of a gray area between 4 or more.
Well, you can only have one ADU per single family dwelling. If that single family dwelling is proposing 2 ADUs, then I would classify that as a 3-unit residential building, which is likely considered multifamily in your zoning regulations.
And they are exempted. We have like 2-acre minimum zoning, and you can obviously have a house and an ADU on that 2 acres. After that, it would trigger another 2-acre requirement. Those would be separate.
Right. If your zoning regulations use lot size as a proxy for density, which many of the regulations kind of in our area do, then yes, you have to kind of apply that minimum lot size requirement for each dwelling unit you would subsequently want to build on a lot.
First ADU would not be subject to that. They're entitled, no matter the size of the lot, they could do it on a 1/4 acre.
Correct. Anywhere where you have a single family house, you automatically can have that ADU, and that ADU is not subject to any further kind of density requirements or additional acreage requirements to have a buildable lot. Okay. Not seeing any other questions coming through right now. I'll do a last call for questions as we're approaching our last 5 minutes here together.
And we do this regularly?
We are the Regional Planning Commission. We are working on a schedule where we have the Zoning Administrator Roundtable at least once a year, and then we'll offer additional trainings throughout the year also that may be topics, for Planning Commission members. But yes, we're on a schedule where we host this at least once a year.
Okay. Is there some place to ask questions where you could get answers? Because a
couple of resources. So the Regional Planning Commission, we can be a resource to you. Another really great resource is if you're on the Zoning Administrators Listserv, which is, you can sign up for free, and maybe I should find that link. It's on there's a website called VPIC, which is the Vermont Planning Information Center website, and they host a variety of different resources for zoning administrators, and one of those being the direct link on where you could get on that ZA listserv Many zoning administrators across the state are part of it, and it's a great opportunity where you can kind of put a question to all your peers across the state and get their input. So if you're not on that, that's like one of the resources. Plus, we at the Regional Planning Commission can also be a resource. And we're also, hoping that by bringing you together like this, you can see who your peers are in your neighboring towns, and opportunities, to ask questions of other people who are working close by to your town. Any other participants know of any other great resources that you use that you wouldn't be without as a zoning administrator, wouldn't want to be without as a zoning administrator? Okay, hearing none there. Kathleen, I'm just putting in the chat the link to the VPIC website, where if you hit that link and you scroll partway down the page, there's a specific section on that page that's headed for zoning administrators. There you can find a little subsection that will take you to being able to sign up for that listserv.
I'm on the listserv, but I've never been able to square it away. It still won't let me post anything. And I've been at this now for like 6 months trying to get that squared away, and I'm not sure who to talk to anymore.
Oh, so you're receiving those, but you're not able to post on the website.
Correct. Sends me error messages every time I do it. Can I respond to anyone else?
I'm just thinking, I'm trying to think who administers that website, if I know of a contact person. We'll look into that, see if we can find you that direct contact to make sure that you have that ability to do that.
Yeah, because I've tried to follow the procedures that they list, and so far it has not worked.
Okay.
It has to do with, we changed our email addresses some time ago, a year or so ago, and it's never worked since then.
Oh.
Well,
it will not accept my new address.
At this point, since at least you have all of our addresses who are on here today, based on the emails from John, you could probably just email us all directly too if you have a question. It would be the same as us getting a listserv email.
And it's about 100 people, yes.
Well, the one from the 19th has just the people who confirmed. So that's like 10 or 12 people. That's not so bad.
Well, great. Thank you, Meredith.
Or you can email me. I don't know.
There you go. Okay.
Yeah.
I guess I should offer it up to everybody else, but you can email me whether or not I can help you or not. Who knows? But feel free. If nothing else, I could post your question to the ZA listserv.
Good, great. So we are at our time limit today. I wanted to thank everybody for coming and participating. It's great to see some familiar faces and to meet some of you that I have not had the chance to meet before. We will follow up by sending you a copy of the presentation along with a link for a short survey. We really hope that you will give us some feedback with that link. And with that, thank you all for coming, and please let us know if there's anything that we can be helping your municipality with.
Happy holidays, everybody.
You too, and thank you very much. This was good.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It was good. Appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Yeah, ditto.
I guess I'll stop recording.